Thank you, Chairman Allen, for the opportunity, as well as Lauren for putting it all together. Brief background on We the Artists of Bay Area. Literally formed by artists in the hours immediately after the Ghost Ship fire. We're a grassroots, volunteer, inclusive organization that have two main goals. Advocate for our creative community to local government, because in the immediate aftermath, we believe that the government, both through code enforcement, would cause evictions, code enforcement actions, et cetera. And second, and as important, is improve the safety and sustainability of our community. You know, prevent evictions and prevent further tragedies. So literally in the hours after, through this group and through the work of John and some of the other folks in the room here as well, which we'll introduce in a few minutes. But initial action, we crafted a petition that within 2 days garnered 11,000 signatures. We talked about the importance of the creative community in the Bay Area, why it makes the Bay Area, and we had wide-scale support. We then gave away hundreds of free fire extinguishers and smoke alarms and trained the community how to use them. I literally could not believe that in the year 2017 we'd be talking about fire safety and structures. I thought we were done with that. I thought that the NFPA report that came out and said that America was burning in the 1970s, which was from Watts and from the Bronx, was over, but it's not. We presented a resolution to Mayor Schaaf, and that helped inform an executive order.
In a bunch of those cases, people were lighting the fires on purpose, right?
Back then, yes, exactly. Yeah. We've been meeting with mayor, city council, the city departments, multiple public policy forums, and then we also partner with the DIY safety group, the Oakland Warehouse Coalition, our community, and I just wanted to give a shout out. We have some of those members in the audience today, Tom Dolan, and Jonas Strauss. We went out and we literally collectively walked through about 50 spaces. We did pre-inspections before the fire department showed up and before the building enforcement showed up to help people stay in their spaces. We pointed out simple things that people can do to improve the safety, may not be exactly code compliant, but improve the safety of the place that they live and the place where they work. We collaborated on micro grants to fund creative space fund improvements. And we helped many, but not all, stay safely in their spaces. And that was within the first 30, 60 days after the fire. What's going on right now is this community, our community, is still recovering from the tragedy and the aftermath. These are words that you generally don't like to see together: investigations and memorials and civil lawsuits and evictions and code enforcement actions. We're trying to do our part by sponsoring a tribute art show in Oakland, which will spotlight local Oakland artists. I will say that the cadence of the activity has really changed. We're in kind of the intermediate part of these kind of events. We're past the raw impact of the fire. It was immediate, it was visceral. We had people we knew who had been in the fire. I know people on the public safety side who responded to the fire. But now we've moved into committees and proposals and policies and rules, and so now it's about enacting change based on what is a way forward as opposed to the urgency of the response. Oakland today is implementing the mayor's executive order. John and I are on the, as well as Tom Dolan, are on the Fire Safety Task Force on the Building Codes Committee. We've also reached out within and beyond the Bay Area. So we presented at Burning Man's Global Leadership Conference, because that's an organization that has regional organizations scattered around the world. We've had discussions with the Community Arts Stabilization Trust and learned from the model in San Francisco. I was in New York recently. I met with the New York City Loft Board, the executive director, board members, as well as the representatives from the fire department in New York. And we've also been collaborating with the creative community in Denver, Seattle, New York City, Baltimore, and Los Angeles, because this is not confined to Oakland. This is not confined simply to the Bay Area. This is a persistent problem. And I just wanted to, today is day 174 post the fire, and a lot of work still needs to be done. So here's what we knew back then in December, that the Bay Area economy was amongst the strongest in the world, as measured by these metrics. In 2015, literally almost half of all of the venture capital funding in the United States went to the Bay Area, $27 billion. A year later, when you went out and looked at the cost of living index, San Francisco ranks #3 behind overall cost of living, not just housing, behind New York and Honolulu, and Oakland was at #7. And measured at the end of the first quarter of 2017, 4 of the 10 largest corporations, publicly traded corporations in the United States, are in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they combined represent $1.9 trillion of market value. And that's Apple, Google, Facebook, and Wells Fargo. So, but the conditions in Oakland are different. There's great civic pride in Oakland. But I think it's fair to say that Oakland has lagged San Francisco and Silicon Valley in overall economic growth. There have been long-running chronic social issues of lack of affordable housing and homelessness and joblessness. Forbes magazine recently ranked the most dangerous cities in the United States, and Oakland is ranked number 3 behind Detroit and St. Louis in crimes per thousand.
Wow.
On the other side, there is a long history of industry in Oakland. Let's not forget that Oakland represents the western terminal of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's the eastern gateway port to Asia. It's the other side of the bridge, which is the most significant transportation structure built over water in the last 50 years. We also have a live-work ordinance in Oakland since 1999, and Tom Dolan had a large hand in writing the language for that. And so the artists are using this inventory of former industrial manufacturing commercial buildings, restoring them to their original use. See, back then, they were building parts of the railroad and parts of the port and naval bases and the military complex. But all those jobs have left, but the buildings haven't. See, the inventory of structure's still there. Now they're being repurposed by artists. So instead of having a manufacturing facility that could make 1 or 10 or 10,000 of something, artists make 1 of something. Same spaces, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go further. Here's another thing. I mean, I think it's fair to say from all the other panelists, controlling real estate or our space is critical to the long-term sustainability of the arts. No space, no art. No art, no good of anything else that we've just been describing here today. And so for most artists and organizations, there have been some, going on the tour today at Wall was awesome. And I tip my hat to the organization that did that. But most of the arts organizations are tenants and ownership is unaffordable and unreachable. Between 2013 and 2016, according to Zillow, Oakland rents increased 71%. So the question is before us collectively, as a community, as a county, as a state, can creatives afford to live and work in our community? I mean, I think that's the simple what this all boils down to. And so what we see are individual projects that become the foundation and the benchmark and the anchor point for thinking about how we think about real estate and space and affordability and housing and creativity, because thanks to the great work coming out of Otis, that this is the gigantic economic engine for the state of California. And that's only on the things we can measure and not the things that are unmeasurable. But here's what we learned on the ground. Historically, the creative community hasn't spoken in a collective voice. We have individual artists. They are in individual studios. They may collaborate on an art walk or through a gallery opening, but we've never really had to come and talk to the government about too much, except if you go through your local arts council or through the state arts council or the NEA. We have a diversity in artists and collectives and cultures and priorities. And here another thing we learned was that the difference of the Bay is a tale of 2 cities. In San Francisco, and I'm going to generalize a lot, the arts organizations are big from the MoMA all the way down to the neighborhood organization, but they generally have more structure. And this is what we determined through conversations with CAST. They're 501c3s. They are either fiscally sponsored or have their own IRS determination letter. They have boards and governance and fundraising. And the arts organizations in Oakland, once again generalizing, have less formal structures, and they rely mostly on earned income, which is great for fiscal discipline because they know where the money comes and goes, because they're literally surviving. And then they're in face of increasing rents. Another interesting thing happened in Oakland right now. The state of California passed a recreational marijuana on the ballot in November, but it's still a local zoning, local control issue relative to cultivation and production. So we see competition for spaces, for industrial spaces from the cannabis industry and real estate developers, which is a very interesting wrinkle to this. As a result of the work on Burning Man Fire, we have large groups of our firefighters that are in Washington and Colorado, which also have passed statewide referendums on cannabis. And so what we see is that lessons to be learned from there, because once developers make tenant improvements in properties for infrastructure of power and water and irrigation and distribution and logistics, they're unlikely to move. And yet that's what we see happening on the ground in Oakland. Life safety and building code issues. Look, there's not a person we've talked to that said, hey, I'd like to live or work in an unsafe space. Right? I mean, we've literally, when we walk through spaces and we point out things that can be done, like, hey, you should have a fire extinguisher there, or it'd be great if you had a lighted exit sign there. Nobody says, no, we're not going to do that. But then it became very clear that the very people that you would go to find out this information about how to have a safer space are the authorities having jurisdiction, which are the people who are likely to write you a code enforcement violation and or red tag your building and or bust you for noncompliance. And so in the meanwhile, we've developed this ability to communicate to our community, let the artists do what the artists do, but let's try to bring safety and sustainability to them. A big question, I think, is we have existing structures. So do we take the existing inventory and uses and occupancies and force them into the existing building codes? Or can we modify the codes for what uses and as they exist, in the inventory, use, and occupancy as they exist? And I think that's a fundamental question. And look, we don't take the codes lightly, right? I mean, California Constitution empowers 28 codes. The Office of State Fire Marshal is impaneled out of the Health and Safety Code. When you take a look at fire sprinklers, I can point to you all over the California Code of Regulations in Title 24 and 19 and 16. However, we really need to think about how do we get more safety faster at more affordable rates? Because frankly, Oakland has had 41 civilian fatalities since December. On the other side, it became very, very clear as we looked at this that these creative communities are the crucibles for innovation. I mean, we came up with a tagline, which is, you know, Silicon Valley had its garages, but Oakland has its warehouses. And trying to measure the economic impact of what those things do in those communities turns out to be difficult, because if I literally took you back to Steve Jobs' dad's garage when Steve and Steve were in there making a computer out of wood, it'd be a pretty big leap to say that they were emerging artists and they would create the most valuable public equity in the United States today. So when we try to think about what is an emerging artist versus an established artist and how do we encourage people and how do we measure economic output and derivation of taxes to state and local authorities, it becomes a very difficult task. So that's what we're all trying to put the four corners around here. I would also say too, the tale of two cities is that to a large extent, San Francisco is engaged obviously in the creative arts, but we see it more of a developing a two-dimensional economy, building things in IT, building apps, building all kinds of innovative things that will show up on your screen, but in two dimensions. Oakland's been developing a three-dimensional economy for a long time. And I think that's a very big difference.
What do you mean by that?
So,
Three-dimensional.
We build things in the three dimensions, and John will cover this.
Okay.
I'd also say that Oakland is a test case for other cities. And we've seen this both not only on a grassroots level of other arts organizations reaching out to us, also when I visited the Loft Board, hearing about that, but when the National Fire Protection Association came to Oakland in the days after the fire, and they said, you know, we really need to work this out because this is a problem across the country of income disparity and homelessness and joblessness. And the result of that is the current codes are great, and I can go to every one of the 500,000 words in the California Fire Code 2016 edition right now, which comes from the International Building Code, and we could look and say just about every one of those rules has somebody's name on it or an event that happened or some tragedy, right? We're pushing fire sprinklers as a result of the Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island. So that's what we've discovered. But I just wanted to point out that as we think about this creative community, we have these spaces that are mixed use in a very different way. They're warehouses. So from a building codes perspective, they're storage, they're S2s, R3s, and A2s or 3s, if we wanted to go quote the code sections. But they all intersect because people work and live and assemble in these spaces, and the earned income that happens in places of these arts communities is because they can't afford to pay the rent any other way. So they have to people need to run events just to help subsidize their ability to stay within the very community ecosystem they need to create. And that's the untold story here. And so who are these people? Well, they're working artists, and they're makers, and they do public art, and they build industrial arts, and they live and live work, and they go to Burning Man, and they run small businesses. They're jewelry makers and photographers and event producers and teachers and blacksmiths and DJs and carpenters and dancers and graphic designers and stone cutters and filmmakers and community. They live in community, and they're woodworkers and musicians, and they do ceramics, and they're painters, and they're social workers, and they're poets, and they're actors, and they're bicycle messengers and artisans and textile makers and singers and glass blowers and incubators, and they're directors and they're sculptors and writers and costume designers and machinists and composers and electricians and welders and inventors and freelancers, but that's the creative economy we're talking about. I just wanted to say that there's been considerable thought on this issue. We can go back to Oakland and through the Planning Commission, the Planning Department. Let's go read from the City of Oakland, the West Oakland Specific Plan of 2014. These clusters of arts activities are hubs of innovation, creativity, and they spur cultural production. Precisely because this cultural district of West Oakland was not planned from scratch, but instead has grown from the self-organized efforts of local participants, this pioneering industrial movement deserves recognition and regulatory assistance and support from the city in the form of a business-friendly permitting structure. That was in 2014. Works a lot of thought in this. Literally, Elizabeth O'Malley just published a few days ago, actually, Cultivating Oakland's Creativity, which is taking a look at, for Oakland City Council, for City Council President McElhaney, what we could do on the cultural arts district front. So the work's out there. People have been thinking about this for a long time, and now there's political will. And as we know, there may not always be political will. And I think this also highlights how much local control that we need to think, and how do we empower our cities to do things. If I will leave you at a couple things, what's next? We'd strongly recommend we need to be able to streamline life safety to accelerate adoption. I mean, literally, a lot of these codes are cumbersome, they were unevenly applied, and as a result of that, they were disregarded. And then a tragedy happens. And now the pendulum has swung in the other direction. So we need to increase public education before enforcement. This is a lesson that we knew intuitively, but also picked up when I talked to the inspectors from the FDNY in New York City. We need to examine every element of life safety and figure out how do we reduce time and lower costs, flat out. Look, there's been a lot of conversations around sprinklers, and there should be. But sprinklers are not fire prevention devices. See, they activate on heat. So there has to be heat before they go off. So we need inspections, of course, and we need to have people who understand what, particularly in these areas where they are creating art and living and assembling. But we need to look at every element, literally from the tip where we connect into a water main to the furthest sprinkler head and everything in between. How do we reduce cost? I mean, what's interesting to me is this is a community of makers. I mean, the people that I go inspect projects for at Burning Man are building pyrotechnic, open flame, propane gas effect, liquid fuels, and they bring all that stuff, and we operated safely. We have an impeccable safety record in probably one of the most inhospitable places where we are the authority having jurisdiction. So another big element. We need to keep people in their homes, flat out, right? My daughter's a social worker in Brooklyn, and what she would say is that literally if you put people outside the system, it'll take them years to get on a list to get back in. We have people in homes today. We like to think of it as wholesale housing. The structures exist. Can we bring in the code compliance? And then guess what? We get the creative community as a bonus. That's what we saw at Wall today. So we need to compare the time and dollars that it takes to create new affordable housing inventory versus what we already have. We have people in homes. How do we keep them there? And how do we make them safer? I think we have to also require that government starts signaling its position to the market on the pace of enforcement and compliance. Because if you're a landlord or if you're an insurer and you woke up on December the 3rd, you were like, wow, I wonder what my liability is. Am I insuring the risk in a warehouse, or am I insuring the risk of an assembly space? So I think we have, because people are looking for signals now. You asked, I think, Terry, what do you say about lessons of ghost ship? Everybody's now looking for, in the era of evictions and investigations and civil lawsuits, like what should I say or not say? Here's what I say. Let's go get some more streamlined public safety out there and life safety into the buildings that will improve on the ground immediately. And let's find all ways we could roll our sleeves up together to go do that. I think we have to understand existing uses and occupancies as well. And we're going to talk a bit about primary and ancillary use and accessory occupancies. I mean, after the 1989 earthquake, where everybody's structures were damaged, there was a moratorium on code compliance. We just can't have everybody do it together. There weren't enough contractors to go do it. So how do we get compassionate compliance out there? Or you'll end up with what happened in Denver, where literally an arts community was evicted in the middle of a snowstorm. Now, I don't think that's what we're all about here. Certainly not what we're all about. And we're trying to get in between that. Well, I also want to leave you with, we should be encouraging investments in creative community-owned spaces, whether it's Vital Arts, CAST, the art space folks, developers that, and I love that term, which is artists need to go find some developers. Well, fact is, these arts and culture districts, how do we, if this is what we value, then we need to put a little more wood behind the arrow on it. And I'd be happy to take any questions, but I'd like to toss it over to John now.